Open source project vCluster has added a big new feature, isolated mode for virtual Kubernetes clusters. To deep dive into this announcement, today we have with us once again Lukas Gentele, co-founder and CEO of Loft Labs. Lukas, it's great to have you on the show.
Yeah, great to be here.
We have covered vCluster earlier, so our viewers, they are aware of the project, but it's good to remind them. So tell us, what is it all about?
Yeah, vCluster is the first certified Kubernetes distribution that allows you to spin up virtual clusters instead of real clusters. It's pretty exciting because you can, essentially create these very lightweight clusters that run on top of other Kubernetes clusters. We're starting to support more and more distributions. It's very, very flexible on how you spin them up, and they're super fast. You can literally spin these virtual clusters up in, 3 or 4 seconds. And you can also dispose them again, after you're done with, your development task, your CI/CD pipeline, right? They're very, very flexible. They're not as heavyweight as, real Kubernetes clusters.
Excellent. We have been covering vCluster since day one when it was initially released. Can you look back and tell us, how has it been received by the community? Last time we had a very good discussion because there were a lot of interest even from AWS folks and other folks. So let's talk about how it has been embraced, adopted, and what kind of interest you're seeing.
Yeah, there's a lot of interest in vCluster. I think since I gave that KubeCon talk last October in LA, that was definitely, kind of the moment where a lot of people were like, oh, vCluster, interesting. I think a lot of people saw that talk either in person at the conference or, attending virtually or seeing it on YouTube later on. And I think that really kickstarted, an additional movement in the community. I think one thing that we saw after the talk is people started experimenting with more and more use cases. Even folks putting virtual clusters in production. Yeah, we've seen a lot of adoption of vCluster in the Kubernetes community. I think, one big sign is definitely GitHub stars. We have like 1,300 at this point. But then also, if you look at the image pulls on Docker Hub, we're actually, going to hit 1 million Docker pulls probably in a couple of days from now, and that's super exciting. I think that definitely shows that vCluster is in heavy use out there in a variety of Kubernetes clusters, and that's just super exciting to see.
And today we are going to talk about this big new feature, isolated mode. But you also said, as folks are using it, they are requesting new features.
One feature being, or like a set of features being essentially around customizing virtual clusters behavior. And we've added a lot of things there, including a plugin system that actually lets you write custom plugins. We're, kind of thinking about establishing something like a way to share these plugins as well in the future to make it easier for folks to kind of have like a central repository where you can, upload plugins and other people can download them and consume them. That is definitely an exciting topic. And the other topic is, like you mentioned, AWS, contributed EKS distribution. We worked on K0S, Mirantis's distribution. In the beginning, we just had K3S. And then we added support for upstream Kubernetes. And it's really great to see that we have these, more opinionated vendor provided distributions inside vCluster as well. That's definitely a really big step, getting all these different distros available in vCluster.
You did touch upon what kind of features they are asking for. If you can hey, these are the big things or big 4 things that we should be working on, but we chose this at this point, isolated mode. So can you give a reason why you chose to release this time?
Yeah, sometimes it's hard to decide which feature to implement and how to prioritize things in a way as well, right? I think isolated mode is very important because it affects a large number of people. We saw different little feature requests like, hey, can you make network policies easier for virtual cluster? Or can we make resource limitations for users easier, right? And those are all kind of like subtasks that lead to something like isolated mode. Of course, there could have been other ways to implement this as like individual little features. But we were like, okay, what should the initial experience of vCluster look like? And right now, before isolated mode, it was essentially, hey, you can spin up virtual clusters, which is great, but then you need to make sure that they're isolated, and that's kind of your responsibility afterwards, right? We don't help you do that. use the Kubernetes tooling, use a whole lot of other tools available in the space, and plug them in vCluster and combine them with vCluster to make this work. But a lot of people struggle to do that because A, security is a hard topic, right? And B, you never know what do you actually need, right? You have to think about a lot of things, and you may not be familiar with the internals of vCluster as well as we are as project maintainers. So we were like, can't we change that and make it a default? And I think this kind of attitude of like secure by default is a very, very kind of strong selling point for any product. So we were like, in vCluster, it's probably going to be very, very beneficial, especially because it makes those first initial steps much, much easier. You may have security concerns from the start. Now you look at, vCluster and you see, oh, there's isolated mode. What does it offer me? And you get this list of like, 5 or 6 security measures that it implements immediately.
Security is becoming a big concern. We are hearing a lot about that. So there's a renewed interest in security, though security was already a topic in the cloud world. So if you can talk about some of the, as you said, there are 5 or 6 things you would get when it comes to security. Can you list them out? What are the clear benefits folks get with this isolated mode?
Yeah, there are some smaller things, but I think there are, 4 very important parts of it. The first one is pod security standards. It's a Kubernetes construct that we're enforcing by default now. There are different levels of these security standards that you can choose from. That also includes a little bit of like custom admission control that we're adding. Pod security standards is essentially admission control, and we're adding a little bit of additional custom control on admission control on that as well on the vCluster Synchro side to make it even easier. Then resource quotas is another part, and that plays well with the third thing, which is limit ranges. Limit ranges essentially that you define, okay, let's say a user doesn't provide any CPU and memory limits for their pods, you can essentially define defaults for them automatically. And then resource quota is the thing that actually limits your resources. You first need to specify resources in order to be able to limit them. So those two things play kind of nicely into each other. And then the fourth component is network isolation, network policies. That's the last step that really enables you to have like, let's say you spin up 100 virtual clusters inside the same EKS cluster, and people launch pods in there. In the end, these pods and these containers actually run inside the underlying cluster. They actually share, they're still in that EKS cluster. So there's network, connectivity between these containers possible. And when you put these network policies in place, you can restrict that network traffic so that you now have 100 clusters. All the containers are launched in the underlying cluster, in the underlying EKS cluster, but they cannot communicate with each other via network traffic. That's a really important part because otherwise, if one of your virtual clusters is compromised, they'd essentially be able to reach any other pod through internal networking. And with network policies, you're definitely locking the virtual clusters in from a network perspective. It's definitely a very, very important part.
How does this have direct impact on the lives of either developers or operators or administrators? How much it was that they had to do it themselves. Now it's kind of helping them to take care of a lot of tasks that they had to do so that they can focus on other things.
Yeah, I think it essentially takes you from not isolated virtual clusters or only logically isolated virtual clusters to much, much stricter isolated virtual clusters. Instead of spending days on that step, you essentially get there in a second by adding an additional flag. We allow you to customize isolated mode as well. So you can essentially say, hey, the standards that you're defining in this limit range don't work for me. I want different CPU and memory defaults that should be applied to pods, right? It is still very, very customizable. So if you need to dive deeper, if you're running into any issues because of the isolation, you need to be a little bit more generous with limits, for example. That is still possible, but you get there much, much faster. You essentially, it's much easier to start from a well-written template rather than having to come up with everything yourself, right? You literally have to first start with like, what do I even need, right? And having that template and having a starting point is really, really helpful to get you up to speed very, very quickly.
As you earlier said, there were a lot of feedback, a lot of requests coming in. So what's next in the pipeline? Of course, there are certain things that you can share, certain things you cannot share, but just give us any kind of overview. These are the things that we are working on.
We're definitely working on improving the plugin experience. That is an important part because we do see the plugin ecosystem as a very important one, because we get a lot of requests like, hey, I want this be synced, or I want, certain annotations be changed, or certain annotations be kept, right? And there's so many even conflicting requests from users because everybody has their own little use case. And I think having that plugin system lets us, otherwise we'd be deciding, we go with user A or with user B, right? Sometimes they are conflicting. And with the plugin system, we essentially let everybody customize their own world, right, to tailor to their use case. So it's very important that that plugin system is super easy to use and very adaptable. It has a lot of capabilities. I think that is a super, super important part for us going forward. And the second one is adding more distributions. Again, we have Kubernetes right now. We have K0s, we have EKS, and we are, thinking about moving forward with other distributions. I think that is a very, very important part as well. There's open source distributions like Rancher's RKE. I guess we already have K3s, so Rancher is covered in part, I guess. But there's so much more we could add in terms of different Kubernetes distros.
If you look at vCluster, what role do you think it's playing in the much bigger Kubernetes space?
Yeah, I think vCluster adds another valid option for multi-tenancy and for isolating and kind of slicing and dicing these Kubernetes clusters. It also makes clusters a lot more ephemeral, and really you start using clusters or virtual clusters, right, as cattle. It's similar to AWS making virtual machines a commodity that you can spin up in a couple of minutes versus having to put in physical servers in a rack. I think with heavyweight Kubernetes clusters, they pretty much represent these heavyweight servers that you have to manually put in the rack and plug in the electricity and the networking and stuff like that. Versus vCluster lets you essentially run a single command, spin things up in a second, super, super lightweight. I think that will create a lot of velocity in the Kubernetes space, and it will hopefully, accelerate innovation in the space even more.
Lucas, thank you so much for taking time out today, and of course talk about vCluster, more importantly, the role it's playing in the larger Kubernetes space. Thanks for sharing those insights, and as usual, I would love to have you back on the show. Thank you.